In this video, we will start creating our quiz game functionality. We will start by making a game manager and a UI manager. So let's go into our project and let's create a brand new folder and let's name this scripts. So this is where we're going to store all of our game scripts. Let's go to that folder and let's create a brand new C# script and let's call this script game manager. So now let's open the script and let's start writing our game manager. Alright, so now we have this script opened, but before we start writing this script, let's actually create a brand new script. And this script is going to be called question. So this is where we're going to store all of our question information. So this script, this class is not going to derive from model behavior, but instead from scriptable object. Alright, so the next thing we need to create a couple of parameters. So the first thing we need to create is the question information. So let's create a serialized field, private, string, and let's call this info. Then let's also create a public string, which is going to be a getter that will return the private variable. So we have this private variable where we're gonna view this inside of our inspector, and we will use this public getter to get the information from other scripts pretty much. Alright, so the next thing is we need the answers. So the answer is gonna have the information, so what kind of answer it is, and also we need to determine if a certain answer is correct or not correct. So for that, let's go and let's create a public struct. Let's call this answer. And let's also put a system.serializable so we can actually view this within our inspector. So let's turn this struct to be serialized. And inside of this struct, let's put in some information. So the first thing is, of course, the information itself. So what kind of answer it is. So as we did with the question, let's actually copy this to save some time. This is going to be the answers information. And of course, the struct cannot have any default values. And so the next thing we need to determine if this answer is correct. So let's create a private boolean, and let's say that this is going to be called something like is correct. And let's create also a getter that will return the private variable. Alright, and this is all we need to do with our answer. And let's now include these answers into our questions class. So let's create a brand new array, which is going to be an answers array. And let's call this something like answers. And by default, this is going to be null. And let's also, of course, create a getter. So now the next thing we need to include a couple of parameters. So as you remember, in the previous tutorial, I showcased how the final version of our game is going to look like. And as you remember, the question had some parameters like, will this question have the timer? Or for example, what type of answer type it is. So for example, can we only choose one answer or can we choose multiple answers? As well as how much score you will gain or remove, either if you guessed the question correctly or incorrectly. So now let's first of all indicate that this is going to be parameters. And the first thing we want to do is we want to include the bool value to determine if this question needs to have a timer. So let's say private bool, and let's call this something like use timer. And by default, let's put it false. And let's also create a getter. Now the next thing is, of course, if we decide to use the timer, we need to determine how much time we will have to answer the question. So for that, we need to include the integer, which is going to be our time. So let's see private int, and let's call this something like timer. And that's all we need. Now the next thing we need to determine the answer type. So for that, we are going to use the enum. So first of all, let's create a brand new enum. Let's say this is going to be a public enum. Let's call this enum something like answer type. And let's say that this is gonna have two types, multi or single. Obviously, you can choose the names if you prefer something else. All right, so now back here, let's say this is going to be a new private variable. And this is going to be an answer type. And let's call this something like, well, answer type. And by default, let's put it to be multi. And of course, we cannot say this is going to be answer type because we already have the enum named answer type. So let's say something like get answer type, but of course you can choose any name if you prefer something else. All right, so the next thing we need is we need to include the score. So let's create a private integer, and let's call this something like add score. And by default, let's put it to 10. Let's also create a public int, and this is going to be, of course, getter, and it will simply return the private variable. All right, so we are pretty much done. Well, almost done. We need to include one more thing, but for now, let's actually leave it as it is. We will come back to this in just a moment. But actually, let's do it now. Let's create a new public, and this is going to be a list of integers. So we need to include the using system.collections.generic. And we will use the list, and this is going to be get correct answers. And this is going to be a getter that will return the list of correct answers. So let's create, first of all, a brand new list. And of course, we need to put in the brackets. So now let's create a new for loop. And we will loop through all the answers. So let's put in the answers.length. And then we will check if the answer, the current answer in the list is marked as correct answer. We will add that to the correct answers list. And we will add the index, which is the index inside of the list. And then of course, when we add all of the answers, we will simply return the correct answers list. So now let's go back to our game manager. So the first thing we need is of course the array of questions. So let's say this is going to be an array of questions. And by default, let's put it to null. And let's also include the getter. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to include a couple of private variables. So let's say this is going to be a private list of integers. And this is going to be called something like finished answers or finished questions. And this is going to be by default a new list of integers. So whenever we finish the question, we will add that question index into this list. And we are of course going to randomize the questions. So for example, whenever we start the game, we will get different questions each time. So we need to determine what kind of questions we already finished, and so that we wouldn't pick the same question. And then we need to create a new private integer, and this is going to be called something like current question. And of course, we need to determine what kind of question we currently viewing. And then of course, we need to do another private, which is going to be our current final score. All right, so let's actually start writing our display methods. So the first method we will create is going to be called display. So we will call this method whenever we want to display a new question. So the first thing we need to do is we need to erase all of our answers. We of course currently do not store any answers, so let's actually do that. So let's go back to Unity and let's create a brand new C# script, and let's call this something like answers data or answer data. Let's actually call this answer data. Let's open this script up and let's change this to answer data. All right, so let's include some of the information. So whenever we're going to instantiate an answer, we will store some of the answers data inside of this class. So every answer will have this script attached to it, and it will contain some of the information about the answer. I hope that makes sense. So first of all, let's create a brand new header. let's call this UI elements. And this is going to be, of course, the information text. So let's include the new namespace, which is going to be Text Mesh Pro. And let's say this is going to be a Text Mesh Pro UGUI. So this is what we need to reference. And let's call this something like info text object. All right, so the next thing we need is we need a toggle. So let's say that this is going to be an image, and we're not going to use the Unity's toggle. We're going to create our own toggle. So I kind of prefer that way. So let's include the namespace, which is going to be unityengine.ui. All right, now let's create a new header, and this is going to be textures or sprites actually, but it doesn't matter. So let's create a new private sprite, and this is going to be unchecked toggle. So we will have two sprites for unchecked toggle and unchecked toggle, and whenever we of course press on the toggle, we will switch the sprite. So let's create a brand new sprite, and this is going to be checked toggle. All right, so whenever we're going to pick the answer, we will of course we will get the index of that answer. So let's say public int, and this is going to be answer index. And let's say first of all, let's actually create a private, which is going to be a private int, and this is going to be called something like answer index. And by default, let's say it's going to be -1. It doesn't really matter. We're going to update that value whenever we instantiate the answer itself. And then let's get and return the private value. All right, so there's actually one more thing that we need to create, and that is game events. And game events are going to be a class, a scriptable object, where we're going to store all of our game callbacks. So like whenever we want to display a resolution screen, or whenever we want to update the picked answers, we will communicate with the game events class, and we will of course going to invoke these delegates. So let's simply go to our Unity project, and let's create a brand new C# script, and let's call this script something like game events. And like I said, this is going to be a scriptable object. So let's simply say that this class derives from the scriptable object. And I actually just remembered we need to include an attribute so we could actually create these scriptable objects within our project. So we need to include the create asset menu attribute. Let's also say that the file name is going to be something like game events, and the menu name is going to be something like quiz game events, or for example new game events. And of course we need to do exactly the same thing in our questions class, because question is also a scriptable object. So we will need to create this asset within our project, and to do that we need to create an asset menu. So this is going to be the question, or for example a new question, and let's say that the menu name is going to be the quiz and the new question. All right, so now let's go back to our game events, and let's actually create a couple of delegates that we will use. So the first delegate is going to be, well, first of all, let's say it's going to be a public delegate void. And this delegate is going to be responsible for updating our new question UI. So whenever we, for example, display a new question, we will invoke this delegate, and then the UI manager will receive this callback, and it will display the new question information on the screen. So let's call this something like update question UI callback. And of course, whenever we invoke this delegate, so we need to of course know what kind of information we need to display on the screen. So we will need to send the question, which is going to be a new question. So when we create that, we of course need to instantiate the observer set. So let's say this is going to be the update question UI callback, and let's call this something like update question UI, for example. All right, and this is all we need to do with this delegate, but of course we need to create a couple of more. So let's create a new public delegate, and this delegate is going to be responsible for updating our question answer. So let's call this something like update question answer callback. And of course, whenever we invoke this delegate, we will send the answers data to determine what kind of answer we picked. So let's say this is going to be the public update question answer callback, and let's call this something like update question answer, and that's all we need to do. So the next thing we need is we need to display the resolution screen. Whenever we, for example, finish the question, we need to display the resolution screen. And we will, of course, going to determine what kind of type of resolution screen it is. Correct resolution screen, incorrect, or the final resolution screen. So for that, we, of course, going to need to create an enum. So first of all, let's create a public delegate void. And let's call this something like display resolution screen callback. And we will need to determine what kind of type of resolution screen we want to display, as well as the score. But actually, as you remember, I created inside of our game manager this private score, which is a private integer. So this is going to be our current game final score. But I don't really want to put this inside of our game manager, but instead put this inside of our game events. So let's simply go and let's say that let's remove this and let's put this inside of our game events class, and let's say that this is going to be a public integer, and this is going to be called current final score. So the only thing we need to determine whenever we display the resolution screen is what type of resolution screen we want to display. So we will create the enum in just a moment, but let's first of all instantiate the observer set. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create a delegate that will update the score. So as you remember, we have this score counter. So whenever we update the score, we need to, well, update the score inside of our UI. So let's simply call this something like score updated callback. And this doesn't need any parameters because whenever we update the score, we are of course going to update this variable, and we will of course whenever we receive this callback inside of our UI manager, we will update the current score on our screen with this variable's value. So let's say public score update callback score updated, and that's all we need to do at the current moment. Right now, let's actually go back to Unity and let's create the UI manager. So let's create a brand new C# script. And let's call this script UI manager. All right, so inside of this class, we are of course going to do a lot of things, but for now, let's just simply create a public enum. And this enum is going to be called resolution screen type. And there's going to be 3 types, which is going to be a correct resolution screen, incorrect, and finish. All right, so now let's go back to our game events. And inside of our display resolution screen callback, as a parameter, let's put in the resolution screen type, and let's call this type. So whenever we're going to display the resolution screen, we will send in what kind of type of resolution screen we want to display. And actually, we might need to include the score, because whenever we finish the question, because as we know, we will have 3 types of screens. So whenever we, for example, display the finish screen, we will need to display the current final score, which is going to be this one. But whenever we display the correct or incorrect screen, we need to determine how much score we added to our final score. So let's simply include a new integer as a parameter, and let's call this score. All right, so let's go back to our game manager. And inside of our game manager, let's create a new private serialized field, which is going to be game events. And let's simply call this events. So inside of our display method, the first thing we want to do is we want to erase all the picked answers. But for that, we of course need to store all of our picked answers. So let's create a brand new private list of answer datas. And this is going to be called something like picked answers. So inside of our display, let's first of all, let's create a brand new method. And let's call this method to be something like erase answers or picked answers. It doesn't really matter. And then let's say that the picked answers list is going to be equals to a new list of answer datas, meaning that we simply turn this list into an empty list. So inside of our display method, let's simply call erase answers, and then we need to of course display the new question. But we of course need to get the random question So for that, we of course going to need to create our new method. And this method, it will return actually question. And let's call this get random question. And the first thing we need to do whenever we are trying to get the random question is we need to get the random index. And for that, let's also create a brand new method. And this method will return the integer. And let's call this something like get random question index. And what we are going to do is we are going to use something that is called do while. So let's create a new variable and let's call this random. And by default, this is going to be equals to 0. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create an if statement. And this if statement is going to check if our finished questions.count is less than questions.length, meaning that we finished not all questions. So if we are still have questions that needs to be finished, we will get the random question. So we will use do while. And if you're using Visual Studio, you can simply write down do and then press tab twice, and it auto complete the syntax. So what we need to do now is we need to say that random is going to be equals to Unity Engine dot random dot range. So we will get a random value between the minimum and the maximum. So let's say we will get the random index between 0 and questions dot length. But of course we don't want to pick current question, we don't want to repeat the same question. So we will simply going to use something that is called finished questions dot contains. And contains pretty much checks if the finished questions list contains the random index. So as long as our finished questions list contains the random, we will try to pick a different question, as well as we need to make sure that we don't pick the same question. So we need to make sure that our random is not equals, or as long as it's equals to a current question, we will try to pick a different one. And then of course we will simply return random. Alright, so let's go back to our get random question method and let's create a brand new variable and let's call this a random. And this random variable is going to be equals to whatever this get random question index method returns. So we're pretty much going to store the random index. We can actually even call this the random index. Alright, so then what we need to do is we need to say that current question is going to be equals to random index. And then we simply want to return the question, which is the current question. Alright, so let's go back to our display method. Let's create a brand new variable and let's call this question. And let's say that this is going to be a get a random question. And then what we need to do is we need to update the UI. So let's simply say if events dot update question UI is not equals to null, because if you don't do this check and if you try to invoke this delegate and if it's equals to null, it will give you an error. So you simply have to check if it's not equals to null before invoking it. If it's not equals to null, we will simply invoke this delegate. And we of course need to send in the question because we need to determine what kind of information we want to display, and we want to display the current question information. What we can also do is we can do an else statement. So if our events update question UI delegate is equals to null, meaning something went wrong, so we can debug the warning so that we can actually know what's going on. So let's simply do that. So I just wrote a really simple log warning, pretty much something went wrong when trying to display a new question, and this delegate is equals to null, and the issue occurred in GameManager.display method. You can of course write your own message, something that you prefer. Alright, so for now, this is all we need to do with this method. So whenever we're going to start our game, we will display a new question, which is going to be a random question. Alright, so what we need to do now is we need to, first of all, we need to load the questions, because as you remember in our demo that I showed what kind of project is going to be at the very end, we're not actually directly referencing the questions, but instead we are loading them whenever we start the game. And we do that by using resources.load. It's a really simple and handy way to load data. So first of all, let's create a brand new method. And this method we call something like load questions. So the first thing we need to do, we need to create an objects or object array, and let's call this something like objects. And then we need to do is we need to call resources.load all, and then we need to specify the path and the type. So the path is going to be questions. So our questions are going to be stored in a certain specific folder. And it's really important that you put all of the questions into that folder. So let's go to our create. Let's create a brand new folder and let's call this resources. And inside of that folder, let's create another subfolder, questions. So whenever we call resources.load, it will check inside of the resources folder. So the questions is pretty much that subfolder. So now what we need to do is we need to, of course, specify the type, and the type is going to be type of and then question. And that's all we need to do. So the next thing we need to do is we need to say that the questions is going to be equals to new question array, and the length of the array is going to be the length of the objects array. All right, so the next thing we need to do is we need to, well, pretty much reference all of our questions inside of our questions array. Okay, so now we need to use a for loop, and we will iterate through all the objects array, and we will say that the questions is going to be equals to object that we loaded. And of course we need to cast it to a certain type, because currently this is just an object, so we need to say that this is going to be a question. And that's all we need to do to load our questions. So now let's simply call this whenever we start the game. So let's try to, for example, test this to see if it works. So let's go back to Unity and let's create a couple of questions. So let's go to new question, and let's say, for example, this is going to be new. Let's say the information of this new question is going to be something like 2 + 2 equals something. Let's create also another question, which is going to be something like, well, something. Doesn't really matter what it is. We can, of course, create a proper questions afterwards, but just simply say something like choose correct answer or answers. Alright, so now let's go back to our script, and just for testing, let's try to, for example, do a for each loop, and we will loop through all of our questions. So let's do a question, and we will debug question dot information, and let's try to see if this works. So first of all, of course, we need to attach the scripts. So let's create a brand new empty game object. Let's zero out the position, and let's call this object something like managers. And let's reference our game manager as well as our UI manager. And for that, we need, of course, our game events, but we don't really need to worry about these. Actually, let's go back to script. And just because we haven't finished with all of the things, just to avoid all the issues that might occur because we haven't actually finished everything, let's simply do not display anything on the start. So let's go back and let's try to test this. So let's try to play the game. And as you can see, we debugged all the loaded answers. So 2 plus 2 equals, and choose correct answer, which is all the correct information from both of these questions. And if I, for example, want to create a brand new question and I say something like just some random text, and if I try to play the game again, you can see that we have this new question. So it's really handy. We don't have to worry about referencing each time if you create a new question. So that's really cool. And for now, as you can see, this is really ugly. As you can remember, in the final version, we have everything more organized and more better looking, because at the current moment, everything is all over the place and it doesn't look really awesome. But we will create the editor scripts for that, and we will fix that, of course, in the future. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you very soon in the next lesson.